Good morning to all of you, and great to have an interesting panel. Somebody specializing in law, somebody specializing in indirect tax, and of course, great to always have the industry point of view. I will start with Aparajita. Although this session is on GST and core, I think it's also important to have a primer in place, primarily around the fact that we also have a regulation which is largely looking at kind of giving legitimacy to the whole industry, and that's come from MeitY. And I refer to the central government, which on April 6, 2023, provided the much needed regulatory clarity to the online gaming industry by amending the Information Technology Rules 2021. And basically, these rules was a culmination of efforts which we as industry had worked closely with the government on, working closely right up to the Prime Minister's office, to the fact that it was also a task force that got created, and subsequently the IT Ministry became the body to whom the business allocation rules were given, that they will become the parent ministry. And we did see the guidelines being notified. Of course, the next step of the SRB formation is still pending. But the reason why this becomes an important primer, I said, is while we discuss GST, it is also that the GST is up for review, which is what was stated when the council said it will be reviewed after 6 months. And therefore, it becomes critical that this layer of legitimacy, which we are trying to work through the Ministry of IT, it will have a bearing later on when the GST discussion comes in on whom should apply what and what rate and so on. So, Aparajita, what is your view on the guidelines and the way forward? Where do you see the regulatory clarity emerging quickly for the industry? And where do you see the risks again in terms of what has been notified as well for the industry?
Sure. Thanks. And I think you used the exact right word, right? Legitimacy. I think that's the first barrier before we swim in deep waters, get to the merit of the law, what can be done differently, how it is operationalized. I think the primary ask of an emerging sector is give me legitimacy. I am not a criminal. We're not, operating gambling platforms. This law was well iterated. Industry came together. It was not an overnight law. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of consultation between industry, between government. It was a well thought out law. And I want to speak about one kind of aspect of the rules, which is the self-regulatory boards. Of course, they've not been fully operationalized, and we're still looking forward to that. But in any emerging sector, when you use the word self-regulation, SRO, SRB, the kind of trigger point that it kind of sometimes gives even the government or even civil society is this all by my self-regulation? It is not. A lot of these sectors which are asking for self-regulation are also asking for co-regulatory models, where they say, look, this is a sector which is emerging and therefore requires industry to come forth itself, and the technical aspects of it need to be regulated in a manner that there are experts in the room. However, where there are rogue actors, where there are bad actors, people who are just doing blatantly incorrect things, there is a need for hard regulation as well. So an SRB or an SRO is not necessarily leave us to our own good. We'll do whatever we want, whenever we want, and we'll figure it out amongst ourselves. It is a co-regulatory model, which the law very much in its current state also envisages. There is governmental oversight. There is iteration in what even an SRB can do, right? It cannot act of its own accord. It cannot entirely do whatever it wants. So I think that's the first point I want to make, that the law envisaged an SRB which was a measured approach to regulating the industry through a co-regulatory model. It is the right approach, I believe. It is also got all of the facets that the industry is already through codes of ethics. Industry associations put out these codes of ethics, which we all know about, which industry is already following, right? User harm, age gating, KYC, especially for high-ticket transactions, advertising, protecting minors from coming on board onto these platforms, etc. These codes of ethics, the industry has already agreed to in some way, shape or form. The SRBs just would have been an effective tool to implement that, right? And I think the idea of the law was very much in the right direction, that where there is, for example, a technical aspect of whether something is predominantly skill or is it in fact predominantly chance, it cannot each time go to a court of law. And I think the last panel pointed it out absolutely correctly, right? It will only go to a court of law where there is extreme ambiguity or where some scandal happened somewhere, someone filed a petition, something happened, right? But it cannot be the default mode of giving legitimacy to a game. That may actually require technical experts to come together and say, hey, look, if you change these features, it strips the game of its nature of being a game of skill. You've tripped that threshold and actually you're a game of chance. No, I don't think we should put this out into the public. Or vice versa. Add these elements so that I can't in any way argue that this is just a satta, this is just a game of chance, this is just a roll of dice. There is genuine skill. I get better at the game the more I play it. I cannot choose to, I cannot just say that, well, I've played the game with someone who's played it for the first time. They also could win, I also could win. There's really no difference. There are certain parameters, technical parameters, hand-eye coordination, as was mentioned in the previous panel, the ability, prior knowledge of the game itself. All of these factors necessarily cannot be judged by a court of law each time. They need to be anticipated, put in place by the industry through a co-regulatory model. Otherwise, we'll always be in a situation in which it is guilty until proven innocent, right? Where you're always fighting for legitimacy within the industry and saying, oh, if it ever goes into litigation and a court ever looks at it and says, okay, you're a game of skill, then I can breathe easy as an entrepreneur. Otherwise, I'm always running the risk of not only the Supreme Court, but a state High Court saying, no, actually, I disagree with this other state High Court. I think you're a game of chance. You're illegitimate. Overnight, your entire business model, your entire game becomes unlawful, right? So I think that kind of ability to legitimize is already something that the industry is asking for. But how do you achieve that, right? How do you get to that North Star? That happens with industry participation, with co-regulation, with government working with industry experts who are able to opine on whether that meets that fine line of 50% skill or is it more than 50% chance. I'll pause here.
Well, thanks, Aparajita. I think even credit to the government has moved a step forward in most of the emerging disruptive kind of industries where they are beginning to at least acknowledge the need for discussing self-regulation. Something that didn't exist. I remember 2005-06 when I was talking self-regulation in one of the sectors that was asking for more security standards. They said self-regulation is like I packed my bags, I went to the airport, I felt myself from top to bottom, and I did declare saying that I'm not carrying anything, and I still hijacked the aircraft. So that was the premise on which self-regulation was ridiculed those times, to a time where government itself is now saying, let's talk about self-regulation, because it's quite clear that if there was government looking at planning to clear the games one by one, and I am told there are more than 25,000 formats which exist today, even the great-grandchildren would be clearing games that were created as of yesterday. So it's quite a humongous exercise. Coming to Payal. Payal, on 1st October 2023, the online gaming sector was subject to a charge of 28%. And here is where we saw conflicting kind of views coming. The industry was paying already 18% on the convenience fee, which was the service it was rendering. The government said, no, the 28% applies on the whole pot. And then after subsequent discussion, it was applied on the deposit. And it itself went through a discovery process where first there was a group of ministers formed, then there was another set of group of ministers formed, and the first set of group of ministers did not come up with any recommendation. And then after a long discovery process, back and forth, then it was recommended to the GST Council, and then subsequently this 28% came in. Something which the industry is still not comfortable in, but having gone through this process, the government still said, hey, in our minds it was always 28, and the industry says in our minds it was always 18, and that's how the back and forth went on. And it was surprising to see that now the taxation was being discussed in minds, and two minds were trying to reach a conclusion. So considering the fact that now that the matter is in Supreme Court, we can't decide on what the Supreme Court will decide, but obviously we can always toy around scenarios that can come out. One scenario is that the Supreme Court says, hey, the government always thought it was in its mind, so it is right. Obviously, the counter argument will be, then why did you go through this discovery exercise of finding out 28%? The second thing that comes into our mind is the court saying, okay, 28 from October 1st, forget the past, no retrospective, considering that this government came to power criticizing the fact that retrospective taxation was a bane. And then, of course, you have another scenario where the government comes out and say, hey, you thought 18, so maybe let's keep 18 for the past. 28 is when from 1st October. So we have all those scenarios up for grabs. What is your take on it?
Thanks, Ramesh, and good morning, everyone. So, Ramesh, since the inception of GST, 28% was introduced on those goods, which were, basically it was a sin tax, okay? So anything like a tobacco, which was not good for the public at large, that was subject to a 28% of GST. Now, on 1st of October, what has happened is 28% is applied to the gaming industry at large without even identifying whether it's a game of skill, whether there is an element of gambling involved, because gambling in our nation, largely it is perceived as something which is a sin, if that is a concept which we identify with. It's something which is akin to a tobacco or alcohol, like people think it's something which is not good for the community at large. So this 28% was introduced with the thought that every kind of game may have a gambling element, because especially the money gaming part of it, because there is a money involved in it, which takes color of gambling in the perception of the community at large. Now, of course, that's a different debate that we'll have later, but if we go to the historic period, now historically the game of skill, the players identified game of skill something which was subject to 18% GST. But with the show cause notices that have been issued, there are crores of rupees of demands which have been raised on the entire gaming industry. And presuming we are looking at the Supreme Court coming up with a decision for the historic period. And there are three possibilities that we are looking at. And of course, there might be other possibility which we don't envisage immediately, but addressing these three that you kind of highlighted one by one, if we think that 28% is something which will be applicable retrospectively, then what happens? Now, there are two issues involved here. One is the rate, which is higher than what the gaming industry presumed it is subject to. And the other, which is a larger issue, is the base, the value on which this 28% is going to become applicable. So we are dealing with two issues, a higher rate plus the base on which it is subject to, because the base is not even the revenue of the gaming industry, it is multifold the revenue. The revenue is the convenience fee or the game playing fee, right? So it's going to be a complete, it's going to drain off the industry, which is growing so fast. And even if they have been invested into, the money is going to be used to pay this huge demands. And I don't think even if the government has recovery notices, they will be able to recover that money, because the industry will succumb to it. Even we are diluting the investors' interest in this industry by, if a retrospective amendment comes through. So that's something which will be not very good for the industry. The second scenario which you mentioned was the 18%. Now, again, like I mentioned, whether it's 18 or 28, the larger issue is the base on which the tax is applicable. And whether it's 28 or 18, if the base remains the entire deposit, then again, it's going to be a drain out for the industry. The third scenario, might be a breather where we say historically what has been done, it's done. The game of skill was subject to 18% on the convenience fee, and the game of chance or casinos and all, they are subject to the larger, higher rate of 28% on the entire value. So that is a breather for the historic period, but when we talk about the current scenario, here as well, it is still a dampener because the base is going to erode the profits and the attraction that the foreign investors have in India. So dealing with this higher rate for the future is only going to be a pain point for the industry, and maybe the smaller players or the mid-sized players may even succumb to it and may not be able to survive this. So I think historically at least there should never, the Supreme Court should consider that this is going to be a big hit for the industry and not do a retrospective amendment. And for the future also, when the 6 months review comes, if there is some regulation which comes up or draws a distinction between a game of skill and chance, then that can be presented to the GST Council to take a cue from there and review the impact of this change on the industry and do a distinction between a game of skill and chance for the game of skill to be subjected to a lower rate and a lower base, which is their actual revenue. Thank you.
I just wanted to add on one more question on that. Considering that Aparajita had mentioned about the guidelines that came in, and you also mentioned that there will be a differentiation that is possible.
Yeah.
Now let's assume that the 6 month or whenever that review happens in the GST Council, tomorrow if there is a mechanism visible that, okay, under the MATI guidelines, you have a whitelisted set of applications and gaming formats, I would say, not platforms also. Do you think from a taxation standpoint, that distinction can be used to create two rates and two types of applicability?
So the review that is going to come up in 6 months, which the council has proposed, that is going to look at the impact of this change of the 28% on the entire gaming industry. If at that point of time, we are able to, like my colleague here, my co-panelist here mentioned that if we cannot run for every game to the court and tell the court, please help us identify whether this is a game of skill or chance. So if we have a format or parameters set that this particular game is a game of skill and this kind of game falls within the ambit of the game of skill, and if you fail to meet those parameters, then you become a game of chance, then that definitely can be presented to the council to take a cue from there, or can be used as a basis to determine the taxability under the GST law. But yeah, along with that, we also have to go with the facts and figures as how this change has impacted the industry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So turning to Suhas. Suhas, you represent the industry in a way. You represent a streaming platform, and you worked and you understand the real money gaming and the non-real money gaming sector as such. Considering the fact that you've heard Aparajita and you've heard Payal on both the legality, legitimacy that's building up for this sector, and Payal from a taxation clarity standpoint, or the clarity yet to emerge on how the industry can be viable. And also considering the fact that, I mean, you are also now witnessing a new challenge for this industry emerging with toll gates, toll nakas coming from Play Stores and App Stores, which is the latest cooking up. You now have a problem of plenty. You have a what you call a triangulated problem coming into you. And in addition to that, you also have a situation where investors have put on hold their decisions to further invest, depending on, okay, which direction the 28% taxation would go in, because at the end of the day, they look at, I have calls almost every week with different, both HNIs and investors globally on saying, should we or should we not, till when, which point should we hold this money that we have kept aside for this sector in India, or do we deploy it elsewhere? I mean, those are decision points that they are worried about. Where do you see all this from an industry standpoint, and what is your ideal ask?
Before I get into that, maybe also broaden the discussion to say that the industry is much wider than only one is, of course, games of skill, games of chance, but also there are a lot of casual games, hyper casual games, and hardcore games. In those games, the tax rate continues to be 18%, right? And then there is a set of games which is real money gaming or online money gaming, as we might call it, where the tax rate is 28% and also the base is the deposits. But across the sector, right, the real thing that you are trying to deliver to the consumer is a good time. And if you're delivering a good time to the user, you will be able to create a viable business model. And you are absolutely right. All these, the whole gaming sector has gone through a roller coaster and has been turned upside down and then up back again. And it has been extremely resilient. I think even the founders who are in RMG didn't expect themselves to come out of it and still survive. Of course, the sector has gone through a lot of cost-cutting exercise. People have lost jobs. That's real, right? But also the industry has found ways and been innovative. How do you satisfy the triangulation of the government's coffers, make the consumer happy, deliver the entertainment value, and also make money, right? So I'll also talk about how the industry is operating now. So there are three elements. When a user comes in, he or she deposits the money, and governments take the 28% GST right there and then. But for a consumer, if you reduce the GST, it's a horrible experience because I'm coming in with 1,000 rupees and getting only, let's say, 780. That's a horrible experience. So as a company, you have to give it back to retain the fun element and let the user feel good about the platform. And then once the user starts playing, you try to make some money off the rake and offset some of the GST impact. The other element which, again, the industry has innovated very well on is thinking about retention. So if you see, the base has changed, as Payal said. So base earlier was on on rake, and now it's on deposit. But the upside of that is also that every game that is played, there's rake collected. On that rake, there's no GST. Of course, still the GST, sorry?
Sorry, the bet value. Every time you bet, it is not there.
Yeah, every time you bet, there's a rake that the company collects. On that, there is no GST now, right?
There is. The rack rate is there.
So on the rake, there is no, it's on the deposit. So every time you're collecting the rake, it's not there. So if you can retain the user for longer and make them play 5 or 6 games, which they do, and nudge them to do that, you still have a GST impact which is much higher, but it's not 5 or 15 times as the industry thought. It is still maybe 2 times, which you'll say, okay, I'll take a big hit on my profitability, but still probably the best ones will survive. And that's what the industry has done to, go across this big challenge. And of course, then there is, Google, which has come up with a very strict. It has always been there, in fact. They've always said that they'll collect 15% or 30%, depending on the size. But yeah, I think it's a balance between freedom given to businesses. It's a capitalist economy. At the same time, you have to look at it, is it a monopoly or not? So it's not an easy answer, be it for the government or the companies. But I do think there will be some intervention, continuing intervention from the government to make sure no one is, using their monopoly position in a way that harms the industry or impacts the industry negatively.
Thanks, Suhas. I think we just have under a minute, and I will turn over to my panelists to give a concluding remark, starting with Aparajita. On fast forward, I wouldn't say peep into 3 to 5 years, but 1 year from now, where do you see regulatory-wise your expectation of things falling in place?
Sure. I think co-regulation, not all by myself regulation, that is not even the ask of the industry. I think codes of ethics that the industry has already come up with, already implemented, are a step in the right direction. KYC, user harm, age gating for minors, etc. I think the bones of the law and the intentionality is already there. It is effective tools to implement. What those effective tools to implement are, according to me, NSRB was a right and effective tool to implement, but what those effective tools of implementation are is left up, of course, to the government at the moment. This is not a lack of intention or a lack of law. It is a lack of enforcement at this point in time, which is causing some of the gaps in legitimacy or causing some of the gaps in actually letting a sunrise sector emerge in its best avatar.
So I believe, at least for the historic period, the Supreme Court should take into consideration that it is going to drain off the industry if there is a retrospective amendment. And going forward, when the review comes up, the 6-month review comes up before the GST Council, it will be very critical for us as an industry to present our case, showcasing to the government, to the council, what is the parameters within which a game qualifies as a game of skill. And skill is something which is required for any kind of employment. And because of that, a game of skill should be subjected to a lower rate of tax, which is 18%, and even a lower base, which is your game playing or convenience fee. Because if they tax the whole amount, including deposits, then it's going to drain off the industry and burden the wings of a fast growing industry. So yeah, that's my bit. Yeah.
So one is, I think, agree with both the panelists. As Aparajita mentioned, I guess responsible gaming, and I guess industry will also keep evolving in terms of, of course, industry is doing a lot today, but I'm sure it will evolve even more, and we will have better ways to make sure it's not too much of a good thing, and it's not leading to an case of addiction. On retrospective, totally agree. I think it should go away. I remember one of the senior tax experts talking at the time of Hutch Vodafone case. That was the first case where this became, retrospective taxation became a big issue. He said that, the government or the institutions have to respect their own law and not change it. And in terms of going forward, I think the base is critical. If we can get the base to rake, industry can still say, okay, instead of 18, 28% and absorb it. And of course, the last one is, I hope we have a large community of gamers. The industry continues to grow at 30 to 40% for multiple years. And we do get a lot of investment from all over the world for this sector.
Thank you so much. With this, we'll conclude this session, and it looks like the GST issue has to be handled quickly for the industry to breathe easy and see financial flows more predictable way and investors getting attracted even more. Of course, the innovation and other side seems to be happening, and the industry will find its way and its own jugaad way to survive, but that's not the way we want to see the industry survive. And therefore, with this, we'll bring an end to this session. Thank you so much.